Welcome to our podcast. As you can see, I've got the team with me at the moment. They'll be at this table. You'll learn more about what they're doing, full-time ministry members, as well as leaders in the churches. So what I'd like to do is possibly just start the conversation. In particular, we're going to be talking about the overcoming spiritual burnout. And I think many of us at one stage in our life go through that. And the opportunity to talk about that, I think I would like to start off this conversation. What does spiritual burnout look like or feel like? And I'm putting that on the table.
Hey, not all at once.
Yeah, I think we're all waiting for it right out. Well, for me, I think spiritual burnout is similar to when a fire is burnt out. There's no fuel left. So it can't do anything, can't provide warmth, can't be used for cooking. So when you're burnt out, you have nothing left to give. You've reached the end of what you had. So you become useless to yourself and to others, kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think if I could speak to the other end of that I've experienced, for me, it feels like like if you're a well, it feels like the well has dried up. Like the tap has no more water, but it's because there's nothing to pull from. I think that's been my experience. Like you feel like you're trying to go and grab something that's just not there. You're trying to go and like stoke a fire without any wood to actually burn. I think that's a big thing that I've noticed with spiritual burnout, is that I think in general, when you're like, we experience it in our lives, we experience highs and lows. And I think the lows are, for me, marked by, I can feel I'm starting to work out of my own strength and I'm starting to strive for things rather than walk with God and walk in that sense.
Yeah, I don't, personally, I've been blessed enough I don't really think I've encountered it in my personal life, but I've journeyed with some friends and stuff that did. And the most interesting one for me was a friend of mine that I was chatting to. And he described it as he was driving a car that ran out of fuel. So he had to climb out and start pushing and carry the weight of the car and himself and do the roll of the car at the same time. And he says he didn't get very far before he crashed out. And so I think the other two guys covered it perfectly. It's a concept of, you have a fire that's run out of fuel and it's gone down to embers, potentially smoking, not even an open flame. And it's that place where serving and a heart response becomes a work and really becomes a hard toil that you do.
Yeah. I think, so how can someone tell the difference between being tired and being spiritually drained?
Yeah, spiritual burnout is not going to be fixed by a good night's sleep. I think you'll notice it consistently over a period of time, and it'll manifest in other areas of your life. I've experienced that to a degree in my life. I have experienced that to a degree, and in the guys that I was working with, is that you don't just lose the desire and passion for the ministry you're involved in, but it starts to kind of funnel into the other areas of your life as well. Your quiet time, your disciplines, everything else starts to become a struggle and a pain as well, because it kind of picks up the slack for that as well. And so you find yourself less engaged with quiet time. You find yourself less and also open to some things that you wouldn't necessarily be open to previously. You might find yourself kind of being tempted more by addictions you might have overcome in the past, or things that you were struggling with that you're experiencing freedom and stuff in, suddenly start to feel a little bit more enticing. The hold comes to you a little bit more, and you start to lose an overall passion, not just for ministry, but for life in general and for your Christian walk and for your relationship with the Lord.
Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think when it comes to seeing the difference, I think as Jared said, a good litmus test is not going to be fixed with sleep. I think that tired, you feel in your body as you feel because of what you're doing. I think that spiritual burnout is different because of the spiritual aspect. I mean, obviously, in secular people will speak of having burnout. Burnout is a common workplace concept spoken about. Burnout is something we're familiar with. I think the spiritual aspect is what makes it different. I think, as Jared says, like, you turn away from the things of, because I think by default as Christians, our default setting is to turn to God when things are tough, when things are difficult. And when you stop doing that, when you feel that there's a distance starting to occur and your tap is dry and you're trying to go and you're just not turning to the word, not turning to prayer, not turning to those things. I think those for me are definitely like litmus tests. Like, okay, where am I turning to in times of difficulty? Because, like Jesus said, my peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. And I mean, that is one of my ways how I can tangibly feel when I'm close to God versus when I'm far from God. Because I think if we have to really bed down into what spiritual burnout goes to, it kind of reminds me of John 15. Jesus is saying, I am the true vine, and my Father is the keeper of the vineyard, and you are the branches. When we stop producing fruit, it's because we're no longer connected to that vine. And I think that's the key difference, because you can keep doing the stuff, but you're not producing good fruits of your own nature. I think that's the difference. Your relationship is at least my key indicator to how I know that there's something spiritually that needs to be worked.
I mean, that's a good overview. Have you ever experienced the time when you were doing everything right? You were serving, praying, attending church, but still felt empty. What's your take on that?
I've definitely had that experience. I remember a critical point when I was in second year where I remember like things weren't going well. I think I failed a module in varsity at that point. It was the first time I failed anything in my entire academic career. It was quite a knock to my confidence. And I remember it was just a tough time. There was stuff going on at the church I was attending. And I really went and I was like, I need to focus on God right now. I can feel it. And I remember I was doing all the stuff. I went to church, I was serving, I was a youth leader at the time. I was doing all the stuff that I needed to do. At the heart of it, I was really struggling with the fact that I was praying and I wasn't hearing from God. I felt like there was like this big expanse, this abyss, and I was sending prayers out and nothing was coming back. And I think it went through for about a month. And I think that sometimes we are so temporal that we want an immediate response. We want an immediate reaction. We want what God says now. And if we don't see it, sometimes we lose faith and we lose heart. And sometimes we have to be able to navigate the quiet. And we have to be able to navigate that waiting season. Because I was reminded of Daniel during that time when he was praying and he was fasting. He didn't get a response. If I'm not mistaken, it was like 40 days. He fasted and didn't hear anything. And the Bible says that the angel of the Lord was caught up in the heavens. And it was sent on the first day as soon as it happened. But it took 40 days for him to get a response. Now, if Daniel had given up after day 2 and not been willing to hear from the angel of the Lord when it came, what would have happened? And I think that for me was such a pivotal moment of perspective, because that's what ended up happening. To spoil the end of the story, was after a month of praying and feeling like I was not hearing from God, the next 2 months after that was some of the most life-changing experiences with God, where I was having prophetic dreams and I was really engaging with him, and he took me to a different place in my faith than I had ever been before. I went into uncharted territory and I grew in my relationship with God in leaps and bounds, and it came from a month of literally feeling the furthest I've ever felt from him. And I really learned inside of that sometimes God cares about how you navigate the waiting. I think that that's an important factor, and not getting burnt out in those seasons when you feel like God's not there. Remembering who your God is. I think remembering your testimonies, remembering how many times he has come through, helps you navigate when it feels like he's not coming through right now.
I think one of the things that stands out is the culture that we've now adapted, because we've got smartphones and that everything is instant. Everything we do is absolutely instant. And I think that attitude sometimes goes across, especially when we're in our Christian faith, where we want God to act now, and it's all in his time. We have to really rely on him, and it's in his time. And I think a testimony which you've just mentioned is that you went through a season and then all of a sudden that season changed, and you had a totally different respect and overview of what was actually happening in your life. So I think that's great thing about identifying where you are, and then obviously that change happening. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I think from my side, I reached a point, and I'm glad I reached this point initially in ministry, because I didn't in the beginning, where I realized that serving in ministry is not the inflow, that it's only an outflow. And that's actually not a natural thought, because you're so involved with church and you're so involved with ministry. You think that because you're surrounding yourself with this, because you're in this environment, because you're with these people, because you're in this community, that you're being fulfilled and you're being sustained and all of this, but it's not actually the case. That's why Jesus would separate himself to pray. That's why David would separate himself and strengthen himself in the Lord. because it's those time of intentional infilling that then give us the capacity and the water level in the well, to pull from Joel's analogy, to be able to give and to be able to serve. For a long time in ministry, I thought that ministry was my inflow, that by being involved in ministry, by doing these things, that's how I'm being filled, rather than seeing that as just a constant outflow of my personal inflow that I've had with my relationship with the Lord and all of those things. And so it comes to a place where it can be very where your kind of like inflow is matching your outflow exactly. As something's coming in, it's going out. And there's never actually this depth that's being built up internally. And so what you begin to give out is just shallow and very shallow. And you can fake it, you can put it on a show, you can put on a mask, and people might be deceived initially, but there will never be any depth or true value to the ministry that you're doing. So I went through a season where I kind of lowered my outflow sources. I closed some of the taps, and I just fully focused on inflow, what I was putting into my heart, what I was focusing on, what I was meditating on, what I was fasting on, what I was praying on, spending time in worship, spending time in the word, journaling, and came to a place where I built up that depth. And from that point then, ministry became easy again. Ministry became a joy. Ministry became a pleasure. Ministry became a love, rather than a working and a striving and a constant need to perform and work for people's approval from an empty well.
Yeah, it reminds me of in Revelations when one of the churches he speaks to, and he says, "You have forgotten your first love." I think it was there, and I feel like that's something a trap we fall into so often. And I think I've also really been investigating, is the right word, the pull between works and grace, because I think that for me, like when you're saying outflows and inflows, I think that's really encapsulated inside of that for the way that my brain has been processing these things. The works is what we end up focusing on because it's what we can see, because we're temporal beings, we're natural. But the spending time with God is when we're reminded of His grace. I had an atheist once ask me, he said, "Oh, but why does this God of creation, who created the whole universe, He's omnipotent, He's omniscient, why would He need to be worshipped by us?" And I said, one, He deserves it. That's one aspect of it, is who He is. We're magnifying who He is. But I think that God instituted worship for us as much as for Him. I think that when we worship, we're reminded how small this is and how big He is, and how big our well is. And how, out of the abundance of the heart, these things flow. And I think when we have that grace filling us, that well overflows and the tap never runs dry. Going back to that analogy, I think that's what grace is. When we're reminded of His grace, when we're spending time with Him, when we're spending time with Jesus, we're consistently reminded and topping up in that sense and getting that reminder that we can do nothing on our own accord, that every man sins and falls short of the glory of God. That no matter what we try and do, no matter what work, what outflow happens, we can't do it without His inflow, without His infilling of grace, without the Holy Spirit being that steward for us, being that driving force.
I think if we were to, let's sort of look at the Old Testament and see, can you identify anyone that had spiritual burnout? I can think of David. He wrote it so beautifully in Psalm 23. How he found refuge in the Lord and to be restored again. Anybody else you can think of, guys?
I think spiritual burnout comes only when you're doing the right thing. What I mean by that is the ladies with the 10 lamps, 5 ran out because they were doing the right thing. They just didn't bring extra, so they didn't think ahead. They didn't have good practices, healthy practices. I think of Elijah, he goes up Mount Carmel, doing the right thing, experiences a burnout. You have all these guys where David in the Psalms, he often says, I'm doing this, this is how I feel. And recognizing sometimes spiritual burnout is God forcing you to take a break. Sometimes it's because of bad practices. Sometimes it's because we've moved from grace onto law, saying, okay, I've done so much, now I have to do so much more because I don't feel valued or accepted or appreciated. So I think there's quite a lot of factors to that, if that makes sense. But I think it actually only happens when you're doing the right thing. If you're feeding the flesh, I think the flesh doesn't get tired. Yeah, hope that makes sense.
Don't overcome spiritual burnout, how that can lead to us losing everything and losing what God has blessed us with. And I mean, when Saul was taking over the kingdoms and whatnot, he was waiting for Samuel to do the rites for the victory that they had won, and he grew impatient and he was moving into the law side of things because he was so focused on what he was doing. He just wanted to get things done, and he forgot what the purpose of those rites were for. And so he went and he did things, even though he did the right stuff, it wasn't with the right heart, it wasn't done with the right purposes, because he was so focused on works. And so you can see inside of Saul's ministry how he moved from being chosen by God and working with grace to slowly caring more about doing stuff, about conquering and using his own will versus God's will, and how that ended up being his demise. And that same kingdom that he was given was taken away from him, and what we know how the story of Saul goes. And I think that's such a good example of the dangers of not overcoming spiritual burnout. That if left unchallenged, we can find ourselves losing what God has blessed us with, and realistically finding ourselves in a space of spiritual death where we lose our relationship with God, lose our connection with God, which is paramount to what we do.
I think the point is, Saul was a perfect example. He actually angered the Lord, and he lost everything because he angered the Lord. So, we need to make sure that we're focusing on Jesus. We're putting God's first. I think sometimes we do get lost as humans. We have brothers and sisters that can always bring us back and put us back on the right track. So how do we approach those individuals? Somebody having a really bad time. If the Lord puts it on our heart, yeah, amen.
Well, if I can share a personal story, actually, I went through a tricky time, maybe not the same context, but I think the analogy and the story actually fits quite well. I was going through something, and I actually sat down with Amir, and I went and I was talking to him about what was going on. And I was like, no, but this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening. And I started telling him about the situations in my life and telling him stuff. And after I had spent maybe 15 minutes complaining, essentially, I was telling him how rough my situations were. And he turned to me and he said, "You said a lot of I and not a lot of Jesus. Where was Jesus in your situation?" And I took a step back, and that was such a call out. So I was operating out of me and not operating out of Jesus. And I remember that was such a wake up moment to go and be like, I actually need to go and check how I'm doing things, because I'm operating too much out of my own work and not out of relying on Jesus' grace. And so that was something very practical that happened in my life, and that worked as a wake up call for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
I think Jesus with the fig tree, that they came to the fig tree and they expected fruit, there wasn't any fruit. And so I think a good identifying factor is just the fruit in people's lives. And I don't know how you would identify spiritual burnout in people that you don't have close relationship with. But, within ministry, you've got brothers and sisters that you do life with. You look at David and Jonathan. When you share that level of intimacy, it's very difficult, I think, to hide. So the challenge then becomes in loving the person enough to not leave them in that place, and being able to recognize it and judging according to the fruit that we see and the progression that we see in people's lives, I think is a good starting place. And then also to identifying factors of regression. I've struggled with addiction in my life, and my dad and I have a very close relationship, and he can pick up factors and patterns in my life that were attached to that struggle or that time or that low in my life. And if he sees those recurring patterns again, it's a cause for concern. This one's a little bit more comical, but it's so true. I had to move back to my parents' place when my business last year, my business took a dive. I came so close to burning out that my tail was scratching the ground, before I managed to gain some air and height again. But I had to let go of the people working for me. I had to move out of my place in Santon. I had to move back home and kind of start building from scratch again. And then fast forward 8 or 9 months, and I'm walking through the house, and my dad says, he says, "My boy, I've learned something about you." Because when I moved here, we were disciplined, we were gymming, we were eating healthily, and I lost a lot of weight. And then I picked it up again, and my dad says to me this line. He says that your stomach reflects the size of your bank account. And so it's just something casual that he said to me, that he could see what financial state I am in life by the size of my stomach. And so when you have that close level of relationship with people, it's difficult to hide things, because they pick up the fruit of your life, they pick up the habits, they pick up the patterns, and they're able to see. And then we just need to love the person enough to journey it with them and call them out with it. It's okay to go sit with them for a while. Jesus went and he sat with people, and he went into the mess, but eventually he got up and he walked out and invited them to come with him. And so we can sit with them, we can love with them, love on them, but ultimately we need to help pull them out of it. And it's their decision whether they're going to follow or kind of stay where they're currently positioned.
Yeah, I think as well, I think on the other side of that is being, when you are helping, I think that dynamic of going into the mess and leaving it is such a difficult nuance to get, but I think it's found in scripture. If you go in, where Jesus says you should speak the truth in love, I think that's such a difficult thing to envision, because I think we're really good at doing one or the other. You can speak the truth, and then we're like placing judgment, and we're like, this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do, and we know how to love and be like, oh, everything's okay. But can you do both simultaneously? Like that, I think is a skill point. I think that's how you really, if you're on this side where you see it, I think that's the key to helping someone, is not coming from a place of judgment of saying you're wrong and you're right and this is the way you should do and this is the wrong thing. Like if you take Jared's story of how his dad came up to him, the reason he could do that was because he was doing it out of love. He was telling him, hey, this is something I've noticed and I really think this is something you should go and do. One, it was the truth. It was what Jared needed to hear. But on the same hand, it wasn't coming from a place of judging him or trying to bring him down or anything. It was speaking the truth in love.
So what advice would you give a pastor, leader, or volunteer currently feeling overwhelmed but afraid to stop? I think you guys have mentioned quite a bit, but what would be going forward or moving forward? What would be the advice that you give?
Yeah, I think two things. And the first one is a principle I've built my life upon. Don't confuse identity with function. Okay, you are a pastor, that is your function, but you are first a son, that is your identity. So who you are is a son, pastor is what you do. And if you can make that discernment and you can get that kind of root in your heart, it removes a lot of pressure of, I have to do this, I need to keep doing this. People are depending on me. No. Jesus is our savior, not you. And we know it when we're talking to other people and stuff like that, but we need to realize that in our lives, because many times in ministry, we place too much of our idea of our identity, who we are, our value and our worth within the thing that we're leading or we're doing. And we forget that we are first and foremost a son in the kingdom, accepted, loved, approved. Nothing we can do, nothing we can add. Us plus nothing was enough for Jesus. And I think that's a starting point. Second, when you realize that, it allows you to do what I think you need to do. We never mentioned this earlier, but when we talk about spiritual burnout, I think about Elijah, who went running and found himself in the desert. And long story short, as Joel said, the solution that God gave him was to eat and take a nap, which seems pretty practical and very simplified, but it is literally that simple in terms of ministry as well. It means that sometimes if you're facing spiritual burnout or you're on the verge, what you need to do is eat. So revisit that place of infilling, spending time in the Word, spending time journaling, spending time in worship, spending time in this, and focus more on the inflow than the outflow. Be intentional about what are you meditating on, what are you watching, what are you spending your free time in doing. There needs to be a season of kind of extreme. And then secondly, take a nap. Identify the areas in your life where you maybe need to just take a step back from, pull back from, and refocus, rest, recover, focus. Chris Vallotton speaks about it, Bill Johnson speaks about it. There are times in Chris Vallotton's life where he was depressed and all he could do was lie on a couch for months. For months, he could not get himself off a couch. Because what he's doing in that season is recovering, is healing. And now that's the extreme outcome of ignoring the warning factors. You don't have to get to that point where you are bedridden now because you are so burnt out and on the verge of ending it all. If you identify these things and maybe just start with taking a nap, maybe putting more boundaries in, maybe being more intentional about saying, okay, I'm going to do this and this. I'm experiencing a time in my life now where I'm not employed by the church, but I am more involved in ministry than I've ever been before. Co-leading a worship team with a friend of mine at church. We're involved with Connect Life. We're involved with the pastoral team. And so, Monday nights is worship leaders meetings, Tuesday night is mentoring, Wednesday night is Connect Group, Thursday night is worship rehearsal. So it's come to the point now where I am very intentional about making Saturdays my Sabbath. So I don't do any mentoring meetings. I used to use Saturdays for having coffees with people and connecting and doing my counseling and doing my mentoring and doing all of that stuff because I'm busy in the week. And I was getting to the place where it was weighing. And I was starting in the beginning, I was full steam ahead. I was chatting to Fricky, I was chatting to Mia and Brent and them and saying, no, we're good, we're excited. And then the one Saturday I walked out of a meeting and I looked at Sibu and I said, bro, I'm so drained, man. And I realized that I need to get to that place where I watch and I'm intentional about looking at those factors. And so now I keep Saturdays for me. I'm very jealous and selfish with my Saturdays and what I do, and make sure that I intentionalize that rest and intentionalize eating and making sure that I stay filled is absolutely advice I'll give to people to avoid reaching that place of burnout where more drastic measures will need to be taken.
Yeah. I think that the Sabbath specifically is such an important principle. Obviously, it was done to a very dramatic degree back in the days of Jesus, and that's not what we're doing and what we're aiming for. But at the end of the day, God institutes it. I think that Jesus goes and says, God made Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath. And at the end of the day, that's an important truth, is that God instituted the Sabbath for us to get rest, because he knew that inside of our humanity, it's easy for us to get stuck in that hamster wheel of just going. And I think that eat analogy that you're using, Jared, is such a powerful one, to go and stop and replenish your soul, to go and eat and consume from God, to go and reconnect to the vine so that the branches can give fruit. Without water, there's no branches. Without being connected to the vine and getting the nutrients and the water and the good things from it, there's no way you can bear fruit again. You're just going to wither and die away if you don't reconnect to the vine, because a branch by itself is not a tree. That's just not possible. At the end of the day, I think one of the other things, if I could just use the analogy that you were sharing of, like, the other thing, when you initially moved in, you were fit and healthy and disciplined and getting everything right, and then over time, this is what happened as things go. Sometimes we identify an issue and then we're like, okay, cool, I'm going to fix it. But we don't actually fix what got us into it in the first place. So we're going like, okay, I'm going to go and connect with God. But now how do we guard against not getting to this place again? Because you got here once. What's stopping it from happening again? And I think that's why the importance of the rhythm of the Sabbath is important, of having it like weekly. That was the reason for the rhythm of it, was rest needs to be regular. You can't just rest when you're feeling burnt out. It doesn't function well for us, because it could happen at inopportune times. Like, imagine if the time that now, I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with the guy you mentioned, but imagine if that guy was stuck on the couch for months when it was a time when God needed him to go and move. Imagine if that's when the spiritual burnout happened. It's not going to work well if you're not ready for because when the fig tree wasn't ready to bear fruit, even though it wasn't season, even though it wasn't time, God cursed that Jesus cursed that fig tree to die. And I never want to be found in that space. So I think it's really important to implement some changes in your discipline and in your structure, to go and say, how do I make sure I don't end up in this? How do I routinely eat? Not just eat when I'm hungry, but eat consistently. Implement things of consistently spending time with God, consistently connecting to the grace and to the well, so that you can go and do these things. Because without him, we can do nothing. We never want to find ourselves in a Matthew 7:21 reality where we get to heaven one day and you're like, God, I did this and I did this and I did all of these things in your name. And he says, get away, I didn't know you. It's more important to know God than to do the things of God. And I think that's the trick, is being able to build into your routine, build into your lifestyle, make it natural to turn to God consistently, even when things are getting tough, even when you don't feel like it, to still go and do it.
Yeah, I think in conclusion, just spiritual burnout doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. And even Jesus took time to rest, and he even sent the crowds away. He had those elements where he was also tired. As you mentioned a little bit earlier on, Duel, that you came back with such strength, with such passion, and you were restored. And I think that's quite an important thing that we must understand, that, it's okay. It's okay to have that. God isn't looking at your performance. He's after your heart. And I think, take the pressure off. You don't need to earn his love. Step back if you need to. Say no if it's to protect your soul. Let your spirit be refreshed, and, don't be exhausted. At least take the time to make sure that you do not get into a situation where you are overwhelmed and have spiritual burnout.
Very good.